The Soviet radar operator thought his system was malfunctioning. The target had appeared suddenly at extreme altitude, moving faster than expected, but that wasn't what unsettled him. It was what happened next. The signal didn't behave like other aircraft. It climbed when interceptors climbed. It accelerated when they accelerated. And when the MiG pilot finally reported visual contact, his voice changed. This one is different. Minutes later, the American jet was gone. Not because it fled, because it chose to leave. By the late 1970s, Soviet pilots were beginning to understand something deeply uncomfortable. They weren't just facing another NATO fighter, they were facing an aircraft that dictated the fight. And once the F-15 Eagle locked onto you, the engagement was already over. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet air doctrine had been built on a clear assumption: speed and coordination would always be enough. Their defensive network stretched across thousands of miles, layered with radar stations, ground controllers, and interceptor squadrons trained to launch within minutes of detection. Pilots studied Western aircraft meticulously, memorizing climb rates, expected weaknesses, fuel limitations, and missile envelopes. They believed that if NATO jets approached contested airspace, they would be detected early, intercepted aggressively, and forced into defensive maneuvers before gaining advantage. The air battle, in their view, was a controlled equation, but equations only work when both sides follow the same rules. When intelligence first confirmed operational deployment of the F-15 Eagle in the mid-1970s, Soviet analysts attempted to categorize it as the next logical step in American fighter evolution. The West had previously fielded capable aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, formidable but imperfect, powerful yet heavy, reliant on missiles in ways that had revealed limitations over Vietnam. Soviet planners assumed the Americans were refining lessons learned, perhaps improving radar performance, perhaps adjusting aerodynamics, perhaps increasing thrust slightly. Incremental evolution was expected. What they did not anticipate was a philosophical shift. The F-15 was not designed to survive an engagement. It was designed to dominate it from the first second. Its twin engines generated thrust levels that pushed beyond conventional ratios of the time. For the first time in modern fighter design, the aircraft possessed a thrust-to-weight ratio capable of allowing it to accelerate vertically. Not gradually, not with careful energy management, but aggressively, almost violently, pulling away from threats in a direction many interceptors struggled to match. Soviet pilots trained extensively in climb performance and pursuit geometry, yet initial analysis suggested something unsettling. In certain flight regimes, the F-15 could simply choose the terms of engagement. That shift changed everything. Reports gathered from Allied Warsaw Pact air forces added to the concern. Observers described the American jet's radar range as unusually advanced, capable of detecting targets before entering their own effective missile envelopes. Pilots began calculating distances differently. Intercept tactics that once relied on closing quickly now risked being met by a missile fired from beyond visual range. The familiar choreography of Cold War aerial encounters, approach, lock, maneuver, engage, suddenly felt asymmetrical. What truly unsettled Soviet planners was not a single technical specification. It was the pattern emerging from early encounters and intelligence assessments. The F-15 was fast, but speed alone was not revolutionary. It was powerful, but power without control is wasteful. What distinguished it was the combination, acceleration, climb rate, radar sophistication, and missile integration working in coordination. It could engage at long range and still outmaneuver opponents in close combat. It could strike first and still retain energy superiority if the first shot missed. In controlled simulations conducted across Eastern Bloc training centers, Pilots flying advanced MiG variants found themselves repeatedly placed in defensive positions against projected F-15 performance envelopes. Theoretical scenarios ended with the same uncomfortable conclusion. If the American pilot maintained discipline and altitude advantage, the outcome favored the Eagle. It was not invincible, no aircraft ever is, but it forced adversaries to react rather than dictate. That realization carried psychological weight. Cold War aviation was not merely about machines, it was about confidence. Fighter pilots operated in a realm measured in seconds, where hesitation could determine survival. Knowing that the opposing aircraft possessed both superior detection range and superior energy performance introduced doubt at precisely the moment clarity was required. Even rumors carried power. The growing reputation of the F-15 began traveling faster than confirmed engagements, and the most alarming statistic of all was still to come, because as operational years passed and real combat data accumulated from conflicts far from Soviet territory, a pattern emerged that would echo across intelligence briefings and strategic assessments alike. The F-15 was not just winning engagements, it was winning them without being lost. And for Soviet planners studying the balance of air power, that detail raised a question far more serious than any radar anomaly. If one aircraft could achieve dominance without attrition, what did that mean for the future of the air war itself? The first confirmed combat reports began arriving from regions far from Soviet borders, yet they carried implications that echoed all the way back to Moscow. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the F-15 entered real air combat under Allied air forces, particularly in the Middle East. Soviet-made fighters and flown by pilots trained under doctrines carefully developed in Moscow began encountering the Eagle in live engagements. The results were not gradual. They were decisive. MiG-21s fell first, then MiG-23s. In multiple encounters, the F-15 engaged beyond visual range, using radar systems that allowed American-designed aircraft to see before being seen. Soviet doctrine had long emphasized ground-controlled interception, where radar stations guided fighters toward targets. But the Eagle introduced something uncomfortable: autonomy. Its onboard radar and weapons integration reduced dependence on ground control. It could search, track, and fire independently, even while maneuvering aggressively. In air combat, seconds matter. Altitude matters. Energy matters even more. The F-15 entered fights with more of it. The Eagle's power-to-weight ratio allowed it to climb sharply after missile release, preserving speed while forcing opponents into disadvantageous angles. If an adversary attempted to turn aggressively to evade, the F-15 retained enough thrust to regain energy and reposition. Soviet pilots reviewing engagement reconstructions began noticing a pattern. The American jet rarely appeared trapped. It dictated spacing. It reset the fight when needed. It disengaged without desperation, but perhaps the most unsettling development was statistical. By the mid-1980s, the F-15 had accumulated dozens of confirmed aerial victories without a single air-to-air combat loss. For analysts accustomed to attrition models, where even superior aircraft eventually suffer losses, this anomaly required explanation. Combat is unpredictable. Pilots make mistakes, missiles fail, weather interferes. Yet the Eagle's record suggested something beyond luck. Soviet military planners did not dismiss the data, they dissected it. Training manuals were reviewed, MiG radar limitations were reassessed, missile reliability was re-examined. The conclusion forming inside quiet briefing rooms was not comforting. The F-15 combined detection range, acceleration, climb rate, and missile integration in a way that minimized exposure time. It struck before defensive maneuvers fully developed, and if the initial attack failed, it still possessed the performance margin to recover. For Soviet interceptor pilots, the psychological dimension deepened. Air combat confidence depends on believing you can reverse a situation. If you lose altitude, you regain it. If you lose speed, you build it back. If you are locked, you break the lock. The Eagle's profile disrupted that rhythm. Reports described encounters where MiG pilots realized they were already targeted before they themselves achieved lock. The awareness that the adversary's radar saw farther shifted the mental timeline of engagement. Instead of initiating the fight, they were reacting to it. Western exercises added further concern. NATO training scenarios emphasized situational awareness, pilot initiative, and independent engagement decisions. The F-15 was built to maximize those principles. It was not merely fast, it was aware. Its radar provided information that translated directly into positioning advantage. In aerial combat, position is survival. By the late Cold War period, the F-15 had become more than a platform. It became a benchmark. When new Soviet aircraft programs advanced, including improved MiG and Sukhoi variants, comparisons were inevitable. Could they match the Eagle's radar range? Could they equal its sustained climb? Could they close the engagement window before missiles launched? Development priorities began reflecting that pressure. Engineers understood that parity required not just speed, but systems integration, and still the record remained intact. The longer the F-15 operated without air-to-air defeat, the heavier its reputation grew. Intelligence briefings increasingly described it not as simply another NATO fighter, but as a standard of air superiority. The phrase itself carried weight. Air superiority does not mean occasional victory. It means control. It means the ability to enter contested skies with confidence that the outcome will favor you. For Soviet planners evaluating worst-case scenarios over Europe, that implication was profound. If large formations of F-15 achieved air dominance early in a conflict, ground operations, logistics, and reinforcement strategies would all be affected. The balance of power in the air determines the pace of everything below it, and that realization led to a new question forming quietly inside strategic circles. If the Eagle had redefined air combat once, what would happen when the Americans built something even more advanced? By the early 1980s, the discussion inside Soviet defense circles was no longer whether the F-15 was capable. That question had been answered repeatedly. The real concern was how to counter it without destabilizing the entire balance of air doctrine built over decades. New interceptor programs accelerated, engineers pushed for stronger engines, longer-range missiles, and improved radar arrays. Aircraft like the emerging Su-27 were conceived with one reality in mind. The Eagle had set a new standard, and parity was no longer optional. But matching performance on paper is not the same as neutralizing dominance in practice. The F-15 had forced a conceptual shift. It was not simply faster or more powerful. It combined speed, detection range, and maneuverability in a way that compressed engagement timelines. Soviet planners understood that the longer a fight lasted, the more variables entered the equation. The Eagle shortened that window. It turned engagements into brief, decisive exchanges where initiative mattered more than numbers. For a military structure built heavily on centralized control and layered coordination, that posed a structural challenge. Exercises across Eastern Europe began incorporating worst-case simulations. What if F-15 squadrons gained altitude superiority over central Germany in the opening hours of a conflict? What if ground-controlled interception networks were degraded by electronic warfare, while Eagles operated with autonomous targeting capability? What if long-range missile exchanges began before Soviet fighters could even close visual distance? These were not theoretical curiosities. They were operational nightmares. Air superiority determines tempo. If one side controls the sky, it controls movement. Reinforcements become vulnerable. Supply lines become exposed. Armor columns lose protective cover. The F-15 represented more than a dogfight advantage. It represented the possibility that American forces could shape the battlefield from above before ground engagements fully unfolded. And perhaps most unsettling of all was this: the Eagle had achieved its combat record not through secrecy or surprise, but through consistent application of capability. Its victories were documented, its performance was observed, its existence was not hidden. It did not rely on invisibility or experimental prototypes. It was deployed, trained, refined, and proven. That transparency carried its own psychological weight. Soviet pilots did not fear myths, they feared measurable superiority. Every new data point confirming the F-15's undefeated air-to-air record reinforced a narrative that could not be dismissed as propaganda. The aircraft had fought repeatedly against Soviet-designed fighters and had emerged without loss in a system where morale and confidence were deeply tied to perceived technical parity. That statistic echoed louder than any press release. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War air balance had entered a delicate phase. Both sides possessed nuclear deterrence. Both sides maintained vast conventional forces across Europe. But in the air, the emergence of a fighter that could consistently dictate engagement terms introduced asymmetry. Even if the Soviet Union fielded advanced aircraft of its own, the question lingered: would they truly erase the gap or merely narrow it? Because the F-15 had demonstrated something fundamental. Air dominance was no longer about chasing the enemy. It was about being untouchable while deciding when to strike. And as the Cold War approached its final decade, another American aircraft was already under development, one that would not just dictate the fight, but disappear from it entirely. The Eagle had proven that superiority could be engineered. What came next would prove that it could also be invisible. As the Cold War entered its final years, the F-15 Eagle had already secured something rare in military history: a reputation backed by numbers. Not rumors, not inflated claims, numbers, dozens of confirmed aerial victories in multiple conflicts against aircraft designed by one of the most sophisticated aerospace powers in the world. And still, no air-to-air losses. In an arena defined by unpredictability, that record stood out like an anomaly that refused to correct itself. For Soviet planners, the arrival of advanced counterweights such as the Su-27 represented progress. On paper, the gap narrowed. Performance charts showed improved thrust, extended range, enhanced radar capabilities. The technological race continued, as it always had. But the F-15 had already altered something more difficult to quantify than raw specifications. It had altered expectations. Throughout the Cold War, air combat was assumed to be costly, balanced, attritional. Even superior aircraft would eventually suffer defeats. Pilots would make mistakes, systems would fail. Yet the Eagle's operational history defied that assumption. It demonstrated that when detection range, energy management, pilot training, and missile integration function together seamlessly, air superiority becomes less about contest and more about control. The psychological impact of that realization extended beyond the cockpit. If one aircraft platform could enter contested airspace with overwhelming confidence, entire operational doctrines shifted. Commanders could plan differently, ground forces could move under protective assurance, logistics chains could operate knowing that the sky above was unlikely to be surrendered. In military strategy, certainty is as valuable as firepower. By the time the Cold War dissolved, the F-15 had transitioned from emerging threat to established benchmark. It was no longer viewed merely as a NATO fighter, but as a standard by which air superiority would be measured. Even as newer aircraft programs evolved, the Eagle's legacy remained anchored in its record. Its performance was not theoretical. It was proven in combat across decades. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story is this: the F-15 did not rely on secrecy, stealth, or surprise to dominate its era. It relied on engineering clarity. It was built with a single mission: to own the sky. And it executed that mission with consistency rarely seen in modern warfare. When Soviet pilots first tracked that unusual radar signal climbing beyond expectation, they were witnessing more than a new aircraft. They were witnessing a shift in balance. The Eagle did not merely respond to threats, it imposed limits on them. It did not chase fights, it shaped them. In the end, the Cold War concluded without the massive aerial clash both sides had prepared for. The skies over Europe never became the battlefield planners once envisioned. But had they done so, one fact would have entered that confrontation with quiet authority. The F-15 Eagle had already proven that in modern air combat, superiority is not claimed through ambition, it is established through performance. And for an entire generation of pilots watching from the other side of the Iron Curtain, that performance sent a message that required no translation. Some aircraft compete, some endure. The Eagle dictated the terms.